One of the biggest mistakes investors make is assuming the future will look a lot like the present. When someone completes a 1031 exchange, they're usually making decisions based on their current circumstances. Their health is good, their finances are stable, their family situation is predictable. Their investment goals are clear. Based on everything they know today, the investment they're considering makes perfect sense. But here's the problem. Life has a way of changing the plan. I've worked with investors long enough to know that the next 5 or 10 years rarely unfold exactly the way we expect. A family situation changes, health issue appears, a child needs help, a grandchild education becomes a priority, a business opportunity comes along, or sometimes an investor simply wakes up one day and realizes the goals they had 5 years ago are not the same goals they have today. And that's why I believe today's conversation may be the most important discussion in this entire series. Welcome back to the Commercial Real Estate Deal Room. I'm Mercedes Shaffer, commercial real estate broker, business broker, and the agent who goes beyond the glossy brochure to help investors understand what they're actually buying. Because when I evaluate an investment opportunity, I'm not just looking at the projected returns, I'm looking at flexibility, liquidity, control, and what happens when circumstances inevitably change. In part 1, we discussed the trade-off between convenience and control. In part 2, we discussed the true cost of convenience by following the money and understanding the fee structure inside many Delaware Statutory Trust investments. Today, we're going to talk about what happens after you've invested, because when life changes, the most important questions often become this: how much control do you still have over your money? Before we continue, I want to make one important point. While I am a real estate broker and commercial real estate advisor, I am not a CPA, tax attorney, financial advisor, or estate planning attorney. This video is intended for educational purposes only and should not be considered legal, tax, financial, or investment advice. Every investor's situation is different, and before making any decisions involving 1031 exchanges, taxes, estate planning, financing, or investments, you should consult with your CPA, attorney, financial advisor, or other qualified professionals regarding your specific circumstances. Now, let's dive into it. Let's start by looking at a simple example. Imagine 2 investors each sell an apartment building they've owned for 30 years. Both investors have accumulated substantial equity. Both are tired of dealing with tenants, maintenance issues, insurance increases, and the growing complexity of owning investment real estate. Both want more passive income and fewer headaches. The first investor completes a 1031 exchange into a Delaware Statutory Trust. The second investor completes a 1031 exchange into a triple net property. For the first few years, both investors are happy. Both receive income. Both enjoy freedom from day-to-day management. Both feel like they've simplified their lives. Then something changes. Not because the investment fails, not because anyone made a mistake, simply because life changes. One investor wants to help a child purchase a home. Another discovers an attractive investment opportunity. Someone else's health situation changes. Another investor begins thinking differently about retirement, estate planning, or wealth transfer. This is where the conversation starts becoming interesting, because the value of an investment isn't just determined by how it performs when everything goes according to plan. It's also determined by what options remain available when life no longer follows the original plan. And that's where liquidity and control start becoming incredibly important. One thing I've noticed over the years is that investors rarely worry about liquidity when they don't need it. When everything is going well, liquidity doesn't seem very important. If the distributions are arriving every month and the investment is performing as expected, most investors aren't thinking about how quickly they could access their equity. They're focused on the income, the tax benefits, and the simplicity of the investment. The challenge is that liquidity is one of those things you don't fully appreciate until you need it. The reality is that none of us knows what the next decade will bring. Families evolve, financial priorities change, opportunities emerge, sometimes entirely unexpected circumstances arise that require flexibility. When investors are evaluating a Delaware Statutory Trust, they are often evaluating it based on the life they have today. What they don't always spend enough time considering is whether the same investment will still fit their needs years from now, if their circumstances change. That's why I believe liquidity deserves much more attention than it typically receives. Not because every investor will need access to their capital, because nobody knows in advance whether they will. A Delaware Statutory Trust is intentionally designed to be passive. That's one of its biggest strengths and one of the primary reasons many investors are attracted to it. The sponsor identifies the property, structures the investment, arranges financing, oversees management, and ultimately executes the business plan. Investors are able to participate in institutional quality real estate without having to manage the property themselves. For many investors, that's incredibly appealing. The trade-off is that the same structure that creates convenience also limits flexibility. When you invest in a Delaware Statutory Trust, you're generally investing alongside a sponsor who controls the major decisions involving the property. The sponsor determines the overall strategy, establishes the timeline, and ultimately decides when the property will be sold. That doesn't mean the sponsor is doing anything wrong. It's simply how the structure is designed to function. In fact, many sponsors are highly experienced professionals with successful track records. The challenge is that the timeline and decisions that make the most sense for the sponsor and the overall investment may not always align with your personal goals, financial needs, or changing circumstances. As a result, investors should recognize that they are exchanging a certain amount of flexibility for convenience. And while that trade-off may make perfect sense for some investors, it's important to understand it before making the investment, rather than discovering years later when your objectives have changed. One of the misconceptions I occasionally hear is that investors must choose between passive income and control. In reality, those two concepts are not mutually exclusive. Many investors are attracted to Delaware Statutory Trust because they want to simplify their lives, reduce management responsibilities, and continue generating income from real estate without the day-to-day obligations of ownership. Those are legitimate goals and goals I hear from investors all the time. What often gets overlooked, however, is that simplicity and flexibility are not necessarily the same thing. A well-structured triple net investment can provide many of the same lifestyle benefits investors seek from a Delaware Statutory Trust. The tenant is responsible for taxes, insurance, and maintenance. As a result, there's little to no management needed. Income can be predictable and the ownership experience can be remarkably passive. The difference is that the investor remains in control of the asset. They retain ownership rights, they maintain decision-making authority, and perhaps most importantly, they preserve the ability to adapt as circumstances change. For many investors, that flexibility becomes increasingly valuable over time. One of the practical examples of flexibility involves access to equity. Many investors spend decades building wealth through real estate ownership. They acquire properties, they pay down debt, and benefit from appreciation over time. As a result, they often accumulate substantial net worth tied directly to their real estate holdings. The challenge is that wealth and liquidity are not the same thing. An investor may have considerable equity while having relatively limited access to cash. This is why many experienced investors pay close attention not only to the value of an asset, but also to the options available to them as that asset appreciates. With direct triple net ownership, investors have opportunities to access a portion of their equity through a cash-out refinance, while continuing to own the property. Depending on the market conditions, lender requirements, and property performance, refinancing can create flexibility without requiring the investor to sell the asset outright. That flexibility can serve many different purposes. Some investors use it to strengthen their overall financial position or create an additional layer of security and peace of mind. Others may want the ability to travel more, enjoy retirement, and truly enjoy the fruits of the wealth they spent decades building. Some may need funds for unexpected medical expenses, long-term care needs, or other life events that simply couldn't have been anticipated years earlier. Others use it to pursue additional investment opportunities, support family members, diversify their holdings, or maintain the flexibility to adapt as their priorities evolve over time. The specific use is less important than the fact that the option exists. For many investors, knowing they have access to that flexibility can be just as valuable as the investment itself. For investors who value flexibility, the ability to make those decisions themselves can be meaningful advantages. What I found is that many investors begin the conversation focused almost entirely on income. That's understandable. Income is important, and for many people, it's one of the primary reasons they're considering a Delaware Statutory Trust or a triple net investment in the first place. Early in the evaluation process, investors tend to compare projected yields, distribution rates, property types, tenants, locations, and market conditions. They want to know which investment appears likely to generate the strongest return while providing the lifestyle benefits they're seeking. As the conversation progresses, something interesting often happens. Investors begin thinking less about the property itself and more about their own lives. They start thinking about where they want to be 5 years from now. They start thinking about their family, their retirement goals, their estate planning objectives, and the possibility that circumstances may look very different in the future than they do today. And that's when the discussion starts to shift. Instead of focusing exclusively on projected income, investors begin thinking about flexibility. They begin thinking about access to capital. They begin thinking about whether they'll have the ability to respond if opportunities arise or circumstances change. In many cases, they realize they're not simply selecting a real estate investment, they're choosing how much control they want to retain over a significant portion of their wealth. And for some investors, convenience is the highest priority. They are perfectly comfortable delegating control in exchange for simplicity. For others, preserving flexibility becomes more important. Neither answer is necessarily right or wrong, but understanding the trade-off is critical. And in my experience, that's often the moment when the Delaware Statutory Trust versus triple net investing conversation takes on an entirely different meaning. So in today's discussion, we focused on liquidity, flexibility, and control. In the next episode, we're going to explore the IRS restrictions that make Delaware Statutory Trust possible in the first place. These restrictions are commonly referred to as the 7 deadly sins of DSTs, and they directly affect many of the issues we've discussed today. Once investors understand these restrictions, they often gain a much deeper understanding of why Delaware Statutory Trusts function the way they do and why the trade-offs we've discussed throughout this series exist in the first place. And if you're actively evaluating Delaware Statutory Trusts, triple net investments, or you're in the middle of a 1031 exchange, I also offer a free copy of my top 10 questions every investor should ask before investing in a DST. It's designed to help investors look beyond the marketing brochure and better understand the fees, risk, control considerations, liquidity limitations, and long-term trade-offs before making an investment decision. If you'd like a copy, you can reach out to me through the link in the description below. I'm Shaffer. This is the Commercial Real Estate Deal Room, and I'll see you in part 4.